European colonialism and slavery did not begin as isolated historical events. They were carefully constructed systems designed to redefine humanity itself. For millions of black people, this meant being stripped not only of freedom, but of identity, language, culture, and dignity. Laws were written, borders were drawn, and narratives were shaped to normalize inequality and justify domination. What followed was not just physical displacement, but a deep psychological rupture whose echoes still shape the modern world. This story is not only about the past. It is about how those early systems planted seeds that grew into generational trauma carried silently through families, communities, and nations. Violence was not always loud. Often, it arrived through policy, education, housing, and economics. Cultural erasure did not always burn libraries. Sometimes it simply erased names, rewrote histories, and denied voices a platform. Over time, these forces reshaped reality itself, making oppression appear normal and resistance appear disruptive. Yet, despite everything taken, something endured. Memory endured. Resilience endured. And truth endured even when buried, delayed, or denied. Today, we begin uncovering how these historical foundations continue to influence power, opportunity, and inequality, long after the original chains were removed. Understanding this is not about blame, it is about clarity. Because without clarity, history repeats itself in new forms. If you value stories that challenge comfortable narratives, restore forgotten truths, and connect history to the present, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes understanding the past matters. Your support helps keep these conversations alive. This is not just history. This is the beginning of a deeper story, one that still is not finished. When slavery formally ended, many believed the story had reached its moral conclusion. That freedom on paper would naturally lead to freedom in practice. But history rarely moves in straight lines. The systems that once relied on chains did not disappear. They adapted. What emerged next was not accidental chaos, but a carefully organized transition from overt domination to structural control, one that preserved old hierarchies while wearing the language of law, order, and progress. Segregation became the first architecture of this new era. It did not announce itself as cruelty, but as separation, as if distance could ever be neutral. Entire neighborhoods were divided not by choice, but by policy. Schools, transportation, public spaces, and employment opportunities were quietly sorted along racial lines, ensuring that access to quality resources followed the same patterns it always had. These divisions were enforced not only by custom, but by legislation, turning inequality into something routine, something enforced by institutions rather than individuals. As cities expanded and economies shifted, redlining followed. Maps were drawn that decided which communities were worthy of investment and which were not. Homes in predominantly black neighborhoods were deemed risky, regardless of the people who lived in them. Loans were denied, insurance was restricted, and opportunities to build generational stability were systematically withheld. This was not the result of personal prejudice alone. It was embedded in federal housing programs, banking practices, and municipal planning. The effect was cumulative, creating neighborhoods rich in potential but starved of support, while wealth flowed predictably in the opposite direction. Urban renewal arrived under the promise of modernization, yet its consequences told a different story. Highways cut through established communities, homes were demolished, and families were displaced in the name of development. These projects were framed as progress, but progress for whom was rarely questioned. Communities that had survived generations of exclusion were uprooted once again, losing not just property, but social networks, local businesses, and cultural anchors that had taken decades to build. Renewal, in practice, often meant removal, and the damage extended far beyond the physical landscape. Housing discrimination tied all of these elements together, where people could live determined where they could work, the schools their children would attend, the healthcare they could access, and the wealth they could accumulate. By controlling space, the system controlled possibility. Even as explicit barriers slowly fell, their legacy remained embedded in property values, zoning laws, and inherited disadvantage. What appeared to be personal failure was often the predictable outcome of restricted choice. This continuity is what gives the story its weight. The same structures that once enforced inequality through ownership of bodies now enforced it through ownership of opportunity. The language changed, the methods evolved, but the outcome remained familiar. Freedom existed, but it was conditional, shaped by invisible boundaries that were no less powerful for being unseen. Understanding this chapter is essential because it reveals how history does not end. It echoes. The past did not vanish when laws changed. It reorganized itself, quietly, efficiently, and with lasting impact. And it is within these systems, not isolated moments, that the true legacy of racial control continues to unfold. Even as Black communities endured structural barriers in housing, education, and economic opportunity, another battleground emerged, one of voice and agency, where the fight was not only for survival, but for recognition and influence. The moment Black people began to organize, to claim space in public discourse, and to assert their rights as citizens, the systems designed to control them shifted again, this time towards silencing. The tools were no longer chains or overt violence alone. They became surveillance, misinformation, legal manipulation, and covert disruption, all aimed at erasing the power of collective action before it could take root. During the civil rights era, this dynamic reached a chilling intensity. Organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Black Panther Party represented not only the hopes of communities denied access to justice, but also the sharpest assertion that Black lives and voices mattered. Yet these movements were met with calculated efforts to undermine them. Quintelpro, the FBI's secret program, infiltrated meetings. Commistum's Plaskzine planted false narratives, and even incited internal conflicts, systematically weakening the very networks that had been built to uplift and protect. Leaders who became symbols of hope, like Fred Hampton, were targeted for assassination, a stark reminder that advocacy could be as dangerous as defiance. Every march, every speech, every vote registered by newly empowered citizens became a potential point of friction in a society that had long benefited from their exclusion. This pattern did not end when the most visible struggles of the 1960s and 1970s concluded. The machinery of suppression evolved alongside new movements. Social media, algorithms, and institutional gatekeeping now act as contemporary tools of silencing, shaping who is heard and whose message is amplified. Athletes who kneel in protest, activists challenging systemic injustices, and elected officials from marginalized communities often find themselves censored, ignored, or delegitimized. Legitimized, sometimes subtly, sometimes with public spectacle. It is a modern echo of the same force that once infiltrated meeting halls and whispered threats, a demonstration that control over narrative is just as critical as control over land or property. The impact is profound because it is both external and internal. Communities are forced to navigate the tension between survival and self-expression, between resistance and reprisal. The fear of reprisal can fracture solidarity, yet it can also catalyze creativity and strategic thinking, leading to forms of activism that are resilient and adaptive. The generations that followed the original movements learned to read the signals, to protect their spaces, and to amplify their voices in ways that could withstand scrutiny and opposition. This struggle over visibility and legitimacy ties directly to the economic, residential, and educational inequities that preceded it. Without the ability to shape public opinion, advocate for policy change, or hold institutions accountable, systemic barriers remain insulated from challenge. Silencing is not merely the absence of speech. It is the absence of influence, the deliberate obstruction of the channels through which justice might flow. In every era, when black voices rise, there has been a counterforce ready to suppress, to delegitimize, and to reassert the balance of power in favor of those who have historically benefited from oppression. Understanding this chapter is essential to grasping the continuity of struggle, because the fight for civil and human rights has always been multidimensional. It is fought not only in classrooms, courts, and workplaces, but in the unseen arenas of media, law, enforcement, and public perception. Each act of silencing is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader strategy designed to maintain systemic control, reminding us that progress is never uncontested and that the resilience of these movements is both extraordinary and indispensable. As black communities navigated a landscape already shaped by systemic oppression in housing, education, and political influence, another battlefield emerged: the pursuit of economic independence. For generations, black families worked tirelessly to build wealth, acquire land, and establish businesses, often in the face of laws and policies that sought to keep them dependent. Yet every step toward prosperity seemed to provoke a response designed to dismantle it, as if economic success itself threatened the carefully maintained social order. From the earliest days after emancipation, when formerly enslaved people purchased land or inherited property, there was a persistent effort to strip away what they had gained. Wealth in black hands became a target, a symbol that equality could be claimed and defended, and that possibility alone was considered dangerous. In rural communities, black farmers faced relentless pressures from white landowners and local authorities. Sharecropping systems kept them trapped in cycles of debt, and disputes over fair compensation often resulted in violent reprisals. One of the most devastating examples occurred during the Elaine Massacre of 1919, when black farmers who sought to organize for fair payment were met with an armed white militia. Hundreds were killed, and no one was ever held accountable. Entire communities lost the property, crops, and capital that could have sustained generations. These acts of violence were not anomalies. They were part of a consistent strategy to prevent black economic mobility, ensuring that wealth remained concentrated elsewhere. In urban areas, the threat shifted toward businesses and enterprises built in neighborhoods already constrained by redlining and segregation. Black entrepreneurs who managed to establish stores, service companies, or cultural institutions were often met with sabotage, intimidation, and discriminatory regulations that limited their growth. Loans were denied, property taxes were manipulated, and competitors were supported by networks of influence that effectively kept black-owned enterprises on the margins. Success became precarious, a precarious balance between innovation and survival, where every achievement was shadowed by the possibility of destruction. This economic suppression was interwoven with the broader structures of systemic control. Housing discrimination limited where families could live and invest. Underfunded schools restricted educational opportunities, and legal barriers prevented equitable access to capital. In this environment, the ability to accumulate wealth, pass it on to future generations, and build stable communities was deliberately curtailed. The trauma of these losses extended beyond material deprivation. It undermined confidence, stifled ambition, and reinforced the narrative that black prosperity was fleeting or impossible. Despite these obstacles, black communities persisted. Land was purchased and reclaimed, Businesses were rebuilt, and cooperative networks were established to resist economic marginalization. Organizations like the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America exemplified the resilience of those who refused to accept oppression as destiny, advocating for fair wages, collective bargaining, and the right to maintain independence in an economy designed to exclude them. Each success was a testament to determination, creativity, and solidarity. Yet the historical record also reflects the recurring threat of violence and dispossession that awaited any challenge to entrenched power. The story of economic sabotage is inseparable from the broader narrative of systemic oppression, because wealth is both a tool and a measure of freedom. Every land seizure, business closure, and act of intimidation reinforced other forms of control, from political disenfranchisement to restricted educational access. Understanding this chapter illuminates how economic inequality was not incidental or accidental, but the product of deliberate and sustained strategies aimed at maintaining racial hierarchy. It reveals why, even today, the accumulation of generational wealth within Black communities remains uneven and contested, and why the pursuit of economic justice is inseparable from the fight for equality itself. Even after generations of struggle, legislation, and activism, the shadows of systemic racism stretch across nearly every corner of American life, shaping experiences from birth to old age and defining opportunities before they can even be claimed. In education, schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods remain underfunded, their buildings worn and resources scarce, while curricula often ignore or distort the histories and contributions of the communities they serve. Children grow up learning not only facts from textbooks, but also the unspoken lessons of inequity, that their schools, their neighborhoods, and their futures are valued less, and that achievement requires navigating barriers that their peers in other communities rarely face. These disparities ripple outward, influencing college admissions, employment opportunities, deep-lend, and lifelong earning potential. Employment mirrors these patterns. Studies have shown that resumes with traditionally Black-sounding names receive fewer callbacks, even when qualifications are identical to white applicants. Professional networks, mentorship opportunities, deeper speculative and generational financial support elements that foster success in other communities are often inaccessible. Black workers frequently earn less than white peers in similar positions, with disparities especially pronounced for women. Even higher education does not erase these gaps. A Black college graduate may still face obstacles that a white graduate would never encounter, from wage inequities to bias in promotions and hiring decisions. In this way, systemic racism transforms education and employment into interlocking barriers rather than isolated challenges. Healthcare reflects a similar pattern of inequity, where access, quality, and outcomes are deeply influenced by race. Hospitals and clinics in underserved areas are often under-resourced, staffing levels are insufficient, and preventive care is limited. Black women experience disproportionately high maternal mortality rates, chronic illnesses are more prevalent, and life expectancy is shorter. Structural inequities ranging from environmental factors to historical neglect compound the effects of these disparities. The COVID-19 pandemic laid these issues bare, highlighting how underlying systemic factors amplify vulnerability and disadvantage within communities of color, creating crises that are not the result of individual behavior, but of entrenched social and institutional inequities. Housing and neighborhood segregation further entrench systemic racism. Redlining, discriminatory lending practices, and zoning laws historically confined Black families to specific areas, limiting access to quality housing, education, and wealth accumulation. Generations later, these effects persist. Home ownership rates remain lower, Property values in historically segregated areas are suppressed, and opportunities for economic mobility are curtailed. Where families live influences access to grocery stores, healthcare facilities, safe recreational spaces, and reliable public services, making neighborhood inequality both a cause and a consequence of systemic discrimination. The criminal justice system compounds these inequities, targeting black individuals at disproportionate rates for arrests, sentencing, and incarceration. Overpolicing in high-poverty areas, coupled with discriminatory laws and practices, ensures that the consequences of systemic bias are felt in the most visible and immediate ways. Incarceration disrupts families, limits economic prospects, and reinforces cycles of poverty, creating an enduring feedback loop that extends far beyond the individual. Taken together, these systems are not isolated failures. They are interwoven threads of a single, persistent structure that maintains disparities across generations, income gaps, educational inequities, health disparities, unequal access to housing, and disproportionate incarceration rates are not accidental. They are the cumulative effect of policies, practices, and attitudes that systematically advantage some while disadvantaging others. Understanding systemic racism requires seeing these connections, recognizing how historical oppression has been transformed into modern institutions, and acknowledging that the struggle for equity is not a series of isolated battles, but a continuing effort to dismantle a deeply embedded and interconnected system. As we look across the landscape of history and modern life, the threads of systemic oppression reveal a clear pattern. The structures that once upheld slavery, enforced segregation, and sabotaged black economic, political, and social progress have not vanished. They have evolved. What we see today, disparities in education, employment, housing, healthcare, and criminal justice, is not the result of chance or isolated incidents, but of a deliberate and enduring framework that continues to prioritize power and privilege over equity. This is the reality of white supremacy as a structural force, a system that operates quietly in policies, institutions, and social norms, often invisible to those who do not experience its effects firsthand. Recognizing this is uncomfortable, but it is the first step toward meaningful change. Acknowledgement is crucial because silence has always served as a tool of oppression. Ignoring these inequities allows them to persist, creating a society in which disadvantage is normalized and progress remains uneven. But recognition alone is not enough. It must be paired with concrete action. Policy reform at every level, local, state, and federal, is necessary to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality. Equitable funding for schools, access to healthcare, fair lending and housing practices, criminal justice reform, and targeted economic initiatives for historically marginalized communities are not optional measures. They are essential steps to correct centuries of systemic harm. These changes cannot be symbolic. They must be structural, measurable, and sustained, addressing not only the symptoms, but also the underlying mechanisms of oppression. Equally important is the role of active resistance, the courage to speak out, to advocate, and to engage. History has shown that progress is rarely granted freely. It is achieved through persistent effort, collective organizing, and the willingness to challenge unjust systems even when opposition is fierce. From the resilience of the civil rights movement to the persistence of modern activism, the power of community and solidarity demonstrates that change is possible when people refuse to be silenced. Every voice raised against inequity, every policy challenged, and every effort to amplify marginalized perspectives contributes to the dismantling of this enduring structure. For those of us watching and listening, the responsibility is clear. We cannot remain passive observers. Understanding the depth and persistence of systemic racism must lead to action, whether it is educating ourselves and others, supporting equitable policies, mentoring and empowering marginalized communities, or holding institutions accountable. Change is neither immediate nor easy, but it begins with awareness, commitment, and a refusal to accept injustice as the status quo. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this story, for listening to the experiences and histories that are too often overlooked, and for joining a conversation that is vital for a more just and equitable society. If you found this video insightful, please support the channel by liking and subscribing so that together we can continue to shed light on the truths that matter and inspire action toward lasting change. Every view, every share, and every conversation helps keep this work alive, ensuring that the lessons of the past guide us toward a better future.